Every moral philosophy ever written shares one assumption, that there will be a tomorrow in which to be moral. Hans Jonas is the philosopher who looked at that assumption and asked, what if we can no longer afford it? This video follows a single thread through the work of a thinker most ethical theorists still have not reckoned with. A man who survived Heidegger's betrayal, fought in a war, and then quietly rewrote the foundations of moral obligation. Two questions will haunt what follows. First, can fear be a moral compass? Not cowardice, but a faculty of perception that reveals what must be preserved. Second, what do we owe to people who do not yet exist? And what happens to ethics when the stakes are no longer justice between the living, but the survival of the possibility of life itself? Hans Jonas was born in 1903 in Mönchengladbach, Germany, to a Jewish textile family. He arrived at the University of Marburg in the early 1920s, precisely when philosophy was being remade. His teacher was Martin Heidegger, and for Jonas, as for Hannah Arendt and many others, Heidegger was not merely a professor, he was a revelation. Being in time had cracked open the question of existence itself. For Jonas, it was the most serious thinking he had ever encountered. He would later call it the deepest and the most dangerous philosophy of his century. Then came 1933. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. He delivered his infamous rectoral address. He cut ties with Jewish colleagues, hustled among them. Jonas never forgave him. But what interests us is not the biographical wound. It is what Jonas drew from it philosophically. He concluded something that most of Heidegger's critics never articulated this clearly. The problem was not that Heidegger was a bad man who happened to do great philosophy. The problem was that the philosophy itself had no resources to prevent its own corruption. Heidegger's ontology was magnificent in its description of human existence, but it was ethically empty. It could describe Dasein's thrownness, its being toward death, its authentic resolve, and say nothing about whether that resolve should serve the Führer or resist him. Ask yourself, what good is a philosophy of authenticity if it cannot distinguish between the authentic murderer and the authentic saint? Jonas fled Germany. He went to Palestine. He enlisted in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army and fought against the regime his own teacher had endorsed. When the war ended, he returned to Germany briefly to visit his mother's city. She had been murdered at Auschwitz. The house was still standing. The neighbors were still living in theirs. He left and did not return for decades. Before Jonas became an ethicist of technology, he was a scholar of something far older, Gnosticism, the ancient religious movement that declared the material world a prison built by a false god. His 1958 book, The Gnostic Religion, remains the definitive study. But Jonas did not approach Gnosticism as mere history. He saw in it a mirror of the modern condition. The Gnostics believed the cosmos was alien to the divine. The true God was utterly beyond this world, unknowable, unreachable. Creation was the work of a lesser, ignorant deity, and the human soul was a spark of the true God, trapped in matter, longing to escape. Jonas argued that this ancient alienation had returned in modern form. Existentialism, Heidegger's especially, reproduced the Gnostic structure. The individual, thrown into a meaningless cosmos, radically alone, with no transcendent anchor. But here's where Jonas broke from both traditions. The Gnostics despised the body and the earth. The existentialists were indifferent to nature. Heidegger's Dasein has no biology, no ecology, no metabolism. Jonas said, "This is the catastrophe at the root of Western thought. We have built philosophies that either condemn the material world or ignore it entirely. And now that world is dying under our hands. What if," he asked, "body is not a prison but a trust? What if metabolism, the sheer fact that organisms must constantly exchange matter with their environment to remain alive, is the most basic form of freedom? This was radical. No philosopher since Aristotle had taken biology this seriously as a ground for ethics. Jonas argued that life itself, not consciousness, not reason, not language, is where value first enters the universe. A bacterium that maintains its own boundary against entropy already exhibits something we must call concern. It matters to the bacterium, in some minimal, pre-conscious sense, whether it continues to exist. And if mattering begins at the level of the cell, then nature is not the value-neutral stage on which the human drama plays out. Nature is already a drama. It was always already at stake. Can you see why this matters? If nature has intrinsic value, not because we enjoy sunsets, but because life itself is a form of purposiveness, then destroying nature is not merely imprudent. It is a moral crime of the first order. Now we arrive at the core of Jonas's project, the argument that made him, for a brief window in the late 20th century, the most discussed philosopher in Germany. In 1979, he published Das Prinzip Verantwortung, the imperative of responsibility. Its central claim is deceptively simple. All previous ethics are inadequate to the modern situation because they were designed for a world in which human power was limited. Kant's categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim which you could will to be a universal law, assumed a stable world. The consequences of any individual act were local, immediate, reversible. Utilitarianism, maximize happiness, assumed a calculable future. You could weigh costs and benefits because the horizon of your action was a single generation. Even Marxism, for all its revolutionary ambition, assumed that nature was an inexhaustible resource. The dialectic of history would unfold on an earth that could absorb infinite punishment. Jonas said, none of this holds anymore. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the power to destroy the conditions of its own existence, not through malice, but through the cumulative, unintended consequences of ordinary technological progress. Nuclear weapons were only the most dramatic example. The slower, deeper threat was ecological. The poisoning of aquifers, the thinning of topsoil, the destabilization of climate systems so complex that no model could fully predict them. And so Jonas proposed a new imperative. Listen to its formulation carefully. Every word is load-bearing. Act so that the effects of your action are compatible with the permanence of genuine human life on Earth. Notice what has changed. Kant asked, can your maxim be universalized without contradiction? Jonas asks, does your action permit a future in which action is still possible? Kant's test is logical. Jonas's test is existential. The question is no longer whether your act is rational, but whether it leaves a world behind. And notice one more thing. Jonas says genuine human life, not mere survival, not a bunker existence. He demands the preservation of a life worth calling human, with dignity, culture, the capacity for thought. This is not environmentalism as lifestyle. This is metaphysics with teeth. But here's the objection you are already forming, and Jonas anticipated it. How can I have obligations to people who do not exist? The unborn have no rights. They have no faces. They cannot make claims against me. Jonas's answer inverts the usual framework. He does not argue that future people have rights that we must respect. He argues that we have a duty, prior to any claim, not to foreclose the possibility of there being future people at all. The duty is not to any particular person. It is to the idea of humanity as such, to the ongoing project of there being beings who can ask whether they ought to exist. In Jonas's own words, the possibility of there being responsibility in the world, which is bound to the existence of human beings, is of all objects of responsibility the first. And now we reach the most controversial, and I think the most profound, element of Jonas's ethics, the heuristics of fear. Jonas argued that in conditions of radical uncertainty, where the consequences of our actions extend further than our knowledge can reach, we need a new epistemological tool. That tool is fear, not panic, not anxiety, a disciplined, imaginative fear, the deliberate contemplation of the worst that could happen, so that we may act to prevent it. Consider the asymmetry at the heart of his argument. If I gamble on hope and lose, the loss may be total and irreversible, the end of human civilization, the collapse of the biosphere. If I gamble on fear and am wrong, the cost is only that I was too cautious. Which error can you afford? This is not a rhetorical question. Jonas is asking you to do the arithmetic. Hope, Jonas argued, has become the most dangerous thing in the world. Not because hope is false, but because hope lets us continue doing what we are doing. Ernst Bloch, the great Marxist utopian, had published The Principle of Hope, arguing that humanity's deepest drive is the forward projection toward a better world. Jonas's book is a direct, deliberate answer. Not the principle of hope, the principle of responsibility. Where Bloch said, "Dream forward," Jonas said, "Fear forward. Imagine the catastrophe first. Let the image of the ruined world guide you away from it." There is something almost religious about this. Jonas, the scholar of Gnosticism, the man who spent decades studying how ancient sects imagined a cosmos abandoned by God, now proposes that we treat the future as sacred, not because God commands it, but because nothing else will stop us. He wrote, "It is the anticipated distortion of man that helps us detect that in the normative image of man which is to be preserved from it. We do not know what we value until we imagine it destroyed." Is this not true in your own life? That you did not understand what mattered until the moment it was threatened? Jonas extends this private truth to the species. Humanity will not understand its own value until it stands at the edge of its own extinction. The question is whether understanding will come in time, or only as a eulogy. Jonas was not naive. He knew the political implications of his argument were severe, and he did not flinch from them. If the highest duty is the preservation of the possibility of genuine human life, then short-term freedoms may sometimes be legitimately curtailed. A democracy that votes to destroy its own ecological foundations has exercised its freedom to abolish freedom. This made Jonas deeply uncomfortable to liberals. It also made him uncomfortable to progressives, because he explicitly rejected utopianism, the idea that the right politics could build paradise. He wrote, "The prophecy of doom is to be given greater heed than the prophecy of bliss, not because pessimism is wiser, but because the consequences of being wrong about doom are infinitely worse than being wrong about bliss." You might object, this is a counsel of paralysis. If we always defer to the worst case, we will never act boldly. We will never build, never risk, never progress. Jonas would answer, look around you. Does the modern world suffer from an excess of caution, or from a reckless, accelerating confidence that tomorrow's technology will repair today's damage? The Silicon Valley creed, move fast and break things, is the precise negation of Jonas's imperative. For Jonas, the things you break may include the conditions under which things can be made at all. He died in 1993, at 90 years old, in New Rochelle, New York. He had lived long enough to see the ozone layer thin, Chernobyl explode, and the first climate models confirm what he had feared. He had not lived long enough to see the word Anthropocene enter common usage. But he had named the thing before the word existed. Today, Jonas is read in environmental philosophy seminars, but largely absent from mainstream ethical debate. This is not because he was wrong. It is because he was inconvenient. He told the left that utopia was dangerous. He told the right that the free market could not self-correct on existential timescale. He told technologists that innovation without foresight was the most sophisticated form of barbarism. He told everyone, in effect, that the party was over, and no one wants to hear that from a philosopher. But consider where we stand now. The technologies Jonas warned about in 1979 were nuclear power and genetic engineering. He could not have imagined artificial intelligence capable of writing its own code, or geoengineering proposals to dim the sun, or synthetic biology that can design organisms from scratch. If his imperative was urgent in 1979, what is it now? If the heuristics of fear were necessary when the worst we could do was irradiate a continent, what are they when the worst we could do is render the concept of the human obsolete? We began with two questions. The first, whether fear could serve as a moral compass. Jonas's answer is not that fear is pleasant, or natural, or easy to sustain. His answer is that fear is the only faculty adequate to the scale of what we can now destroy. Every other moral emotion, love, compassion, duty, assumes a world that will persist. Fear alone registers the possibility that it might not, and in that registration lies the beginning of responsibility. The second question, what we owe to those who do not yet exist. Jonas's answer is equally severe. We owe them everything, not because they've asked, but because our power to erase them is the one power that no future generation can undo. He did not offer comfort. He did not promise that things would be fine. He offered only a duty so heavy that most of us would rather pretend it does not exist. The philosopher who survived his teacher's betrayal, who buried his mother in memory only.